Hi, everyone. Anya Schifrin is an academic at Columbia University in New York. Her expertise spans global media, innovation, and human rights. Her books include Global Muckraking, 100 Years of Investigative Reporting from Around the World. That one was from 2014. And Media Capture, How Money, Digital Platforms, and Governments Control the News. That one was from just last year. We have the scoop on her new publication, a forthcoming academic paper in the International Journal of Communication. And it's about disinformation and rising fascism in the 1930s. And there are eerie parallels to today. And this research has an Australian connection. So Anya, welcome to Australia. Great to have you here. Tell us, who is Clyde Miller and what is the Institute of Propaganda Analysis?
Thank you so much for inviting me, and glad to be in Australia again. Clyde Miller was a journalist, originally I think from Ohio, who came to Columbia University Teachers College in the 1930s. And like many people of the day, was very, very worried about what they used to call propaganda, but today we might call disinformation. And he started something called the Institute for Propaganda Analysis to teach people how to tell whether something was false or not. So in many ways, it was very much like efforts today to counter online mis and disinformation.
Great, thank you. And you've obviously then had to do a deep dive into media literacy. What are some of the things that you've learned about media literacy then and now and its efficacy?
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the reasons I find Clyde Miller so fascinating is that many of the things he tried to do are still being done today. So one of the things he really believed in was that if you could just educate people and sort of help them open their minds and galvanize their scientific impulses, people themselves would be able to figure out whether something was true or not. So that's a very common idea today as well with media literacy. And he tackled, like people do today, school children. And he really tried to help people question themselves and think actively when they were reading. You know, does this make sense? What is the agenda? He analyzed the techniques that were used, very much like Claire Wardle and other people have done today. He made taxonomies of different kinds of disinformation and different tactics. And he also believed very much in anti-racist education because he felt that racism was a sort of form of toxic disinformation. And he got very involved in anti-racist education movements in the 1930s, which was a big deal at that time, just as it is today.
Of course. So this story ends happily, of course, right? So Clyde Miller solved the problem of misinformation once and for all. Is that right?
Well, I think what was so sad about him was he was part of a sort of popular front in the 1930s of, you know, what were later called premature anti-fascists. And so he wasn't, he was, I don't want to say he was blacklisted because he was sort of a little bit before McCarthyism, but he and many other people who were sort of John Dewey types at Columbia ended up getting fired. And he really never worked in academia again. And he complained at the time that it was a violation of academic freedom. And so it's sort of a sad ending, which has made working on him kind of sad because the people that were combating propaganda in the 1930s, in a way, they failed. We ended up with World War II. We ended up with, you know, fascism, terrible communist propaganda. So it's kind of a lesson in a way that even though media literacy is incredibly important, counting on people's common sense and scientific reasoning probably isn't going to be enough to solve the problem. And I guess finally, I just want to say the Australia connection is that his son grew up and became a doctor, and the whole family moved in 1971, first to Sydney and then to Lismore. And that's where Clyde Miller died. And thanks to my wonderful researcher, we've actually found his grandchildren. So I'll be meeting one of them in Melbourne later this month.
Oh, fantastic. Well, welcome again to Australia for another time. And thanks for being part of this interview.
Thank you for being interested in Clyde Miller and the Institute for Propaganda Analysis.